Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Well, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're going to be talking to Robert Connor. He goes by Bob, though, correct?
That's correct.
He's written a new book. It's called General Gordon Granger. The subtitle is The Savior of Chickamauga and the Man Behind Juneteenth. So welcome, Bob. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
And I'll just say quick, I'll mention this a few times as we speak. You're going to be here on March 27th at our noon author talk. You can come if you want to hear more than you hear today and ask Bob some questions. So welcome. Before we talk about the book, you were telling me before we started, you used to work at the Gazette. Why don't we just give people the capsule biography, and then we'll talk about your book. how maybe you went from journalism to writing history.
Well, we were also talking before about the great internet and all the pluses and minuses of the internet, and both of them are relevant to my story, I guess. The Gazette has been laying people off for about 20 years, and many other newspapers are laying people off, and the main reason for that is the internet has sucked away their advertising and some of their readers, and so newspapers are in trouble. And I did work for them for more than 20 years, and I was laid off towards the end of '08. Actually, they brought me back a couple of years later, just part-time for a bit, and now I dabble in online journalism. But basically, I'm out of the newspaper business, so I have been doing other things since then. I've worked at Grant Cottage a couple of seasons. I work in a drug alcohol halfway house, and I write books.
Okay. So you're still writing. That's good.
I am.
Well, now your book here, it is your first book. You've taken a relatively little known, I don't want to say obscure, but a little known commander, and I was reading some stuff. You sort of got into him in a roundabout way. So how did you get interested in him?
Well, I, like probably many of the people watching or who are going to come to my talk, have long been very interested in the Civil War, as are many other people. And the reasons for that are kind of obvious. So the Civil War was this huge event in American history which cost more American lives than any other war. And there are just an enormous number of stories in it, many of them about people who are obscure, like Granger, who has never had a biography written about him before, which is one reason why I picked him to write about, because I figured it was saleable. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised that I did sell the book, and so it's not self-published. It is published by a legitimate publisher. Not that I'm saying it's illegitimate to self-publish. Self-publishing is very common these days, but for obvious reasons, I'd prefer to get it published through the... Anyway, so Granger is obscure, that's true, but another way of looking at it is in 1861, almost everyone or many of the people who became famous in the Civil War were completely obscure figures, and that includes Ulysses Grant, who, as you probably know, was a clerk in a store when the Civil War opened, and nobody would ever have heard of him except for the start of the Civil War. Granger was obscure in a different way. While Grant had resigned from the Army before the Civil War, Granger, who was in...
Well, he was a career, I think I read he was 30 years in the Army, was it?
Yeah,
okay,
which is kind of unusual, because many people like Grant had resigned before the war or resigned to join the Confederacy when the war started. But Granger was still in the Army in 1861, but talk about obscurity, he was a 39-year-old lieutenant. So even for the peacetime United States Army, that's a pretty slow promotion track. But because the Army massively expands in 1861, and because almost half of the existing officer corps resigns to join the enemy, just because of supply and demand, people like Granger and Grant are rapidly promoted when the war starts.
So what made you, as you looked into him, what sort of fascinated you with it? Or interested you enough that you'd say, this guy deserves a whole book?
Well, okay, I was reading about George Thomas, who was a more famous general, not as obscure as Granger, who is known as the Rock of Chickamauga, which is a reference to a battle in northeastern Georgia in 1863. Thomas, by the way, was married and buried in Troy, New York.
Oh,
so there's a local connection there. Thomas saved the Union Army. The stand that he made on Snodgrass Hill at Chickamauga saved the Union Army from a catastrophic defeat. Chickamauga was a Union defeat because the Confederates broke the Union line. About half the Union line collapsed. Several major generals, including the commanding general Rosecrans, fled the battlefield back to Chattanooga.
When you say fled, did they just desert or just?
Well, desert is a bit of a harsh word.
They retreated?
Secretary of Stanton, the Secretary of War, really did describe Rosecrans's actions in those terms. What happened was...
So he held the ground there.
Thomas did, yes. Rosecrans fled is inaccurate. It was not an organized retreat. They were going pell-mell to the rear to Chattanooga. And if Thomas had not been able to hold on, very likely the whole army would have been captured, which never actually happened to a Union army during the Civil War, although it happened to 3 Confederate armies opposed by Grant at Donelson, Vicksburg, and Appomattox. So if the Union Army had been captured at Chickamauga, it would have been a catastrophic defeat, and there would have been no Union victory at Chattanooga.
That was the next big battle was Chattanooga, and so you say kind of if he didn't hold that spot, then they most likely may have either been captured or may have lost the Battle of Chattanooga.
Well, they would never have been a battle.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
The whole army would have been captured.
Okay. So then, where does Granger come in then?
Well, I'll get to Granger in a second here. But the potential effects of a loss, and this may seem like a stretch, but the next year in the real world, as history actually developed, Lincoln was very concerned about his re-election campaign and thought for quite a while he would lose because the war, according to the perception of many people in the North, was not going that well. From our perspective, looking back, it seems like sort of the Union is progressing to win the war, but many people in the North did not think that. It looked, especially in Virginia, like a stalemate. And had the whole Army of the Cumberland been lost in late 1863, that might well have affected the course of that election and thus potentially the course of American history.
So Chickamauga was a pivotal battle.
It could have been a much more pivotal one if it had been a complete Confederate victory, as it very nearly was. Where Granger comes in is that Granger is in command of the Reserve Corps, and he's holding on, kind of guarding these mountain passes to keep a line of retreat open under somewhat ambiguous orders on the morning of September 20th of 1863. The Union Army collapses that morning, and Granger can hear this huge battle going on a few miles away to his south. He sends 3 messengers seeking orders from Rosecrans. He's not in touch with the telegraph, and the messengers come back and they can't find Rosecrans, the reason being that he has fled the battlefield. And so Granger is sort of left on his own to decide what to do, decides to march to the relief of Thomas, fights with Thomas for the rest of that day, is left in command while Thomas goes to organize a retreat, and Thomas and Granger organize a retreat of that army at first to a halfway point, and then the next day, under Rosecrans' orders from Chattanooga, the whole army retreats back to Chattanooga. But they're retreating in good order, as opposed to in this kind of calamitous pell-mell collapse.
So they sort of saved the Confederates from capturing the whole...
My view is they did, yeah. And so thus, that's Granger's most significant day in the Civil War.
Okay. Now, in your book, you go to great lengths, and this comes up throughout the whole book, and maybe it's the main point of about General Granger, his personality. What can you say about his personality that it seems to have been both? It seems to have been both a help and a hindrance to his career and as a military commander.
I think that's a very fair analysis. His personality was difficult, and I think Grant found it difficult. There's lots of reasons for the kind of Grant-Granger clash, because they never got on, and Grant never cared for Granger, as Grant makes clear in his own memoirs.
Well, both Grant and Sheridan, they both mention Granger in
their memoirs.
And those are the two of the most famous memoirs of the Civil War, and he is
sure, especially Grant's.
Okay.
And Granger figures negatively in Grant's. In Sheridan is more positive, because Granger has kind of an interesting relationship to Sheridan, that he starts off as a mentor of Sheridan's, as Sheridan's commander, but by the end of the war, or at war, or immediately after the war, which is where Juneteenth comes in, he is serving under Sheridan. So Sheridan becomes a favorite of Grant's, whereas Granger is by no means a favorite of Grant's.
All right, so we can get back to tell us about his personality.
Sure. I'm sorry. Yeah, I got distracted there.
Well,
his personality.
The thing with the Civil War, it can always go off into
right. You can. Now, if you were being negative about Granger's personality, as perhaps Grant might look at it, he's a swaggering martinet, full of himself, bad-tempered. He could be a drinker, as could Grant. And there's at least one occasion described in the book where he really behaves in a kind of drunken way, which is really, you can't defend. And that came to Grant's attention.
It wasn't during a battle.
It was not during a battle. It was during Christmas 1863 when he's in Knoxville, Tennessee, and he sends a message to Grant, which is sort of drunkenly parodying a message Thomas had sent a few months earlier. It's kind of a long story.
He does sound like...
He's a bit difficult. He also could drive his troops hard in ways that sometimes the troops reacted against. He almost provokes a mutiny just before Chickamauga. So he can be difficult.
Okay.
Now, the positive side of that, and there is a positive side, is sometimes he's standing up for those troops. Like there's a famous dispute between him and Grant right after Chattanooga, when Grant is furious because Granger does not immediately leave as ordered to relieve Knoxville, Tennessee, which is being besieged by a separate Confederate army under Longstreet, which is besieging General Burnside in Knoxville. Granger does not march immediately to the relief because he is trying to get what he regards as adequate supplies for his troops. Grant thinks that's a ridiculous excuse, but in reality, as the book will show, Granger is about and does fight a winter campaign, which happens to be a hard winter in the mountains of East Tennessee. His troops have spent several months on short rations, and they are woefully ill-clad. They have no shoes in some cases. They have no tents. People are going to die during that winter because of this. And Granger is fighting throughout it to try and get adequate supplies for his troops. And he doesn't care if he has to argue with Grant and repeatedly complain and demand and fight. And from Grant's perspective, he's being a real pain in the neck. But from Granger's perspective, he's trying to protect people from dying in the winter conditions.
Now, do his men know that he's given Grant a hard time?
That's a good question.
Because then he may be, then they would...
I think his men did come to respect Granger, and I think they did come to realize that he had their best interests at heart.
Okay.
I do think that. There's lots of cases of troops who at first find him overbearing and too much of a disciplinarian, but then come to respect him, and in many cases like him.
All right. So, what so his personality sort of carried him through his whole.
Yeah, his personality. For example, when it comes to combat, I think both Grant and Granger are courageous soldiers, but they react to combat differently. Grant is very calm in combat, whereas Granger becomes excitable but their military records of both of them, including in the Mexican War, when they were both junior officers. The Mexican War, which again comes into the book, is obviously a much less significant and smaller war than the Civil War, but is still highly historically significant. I mean, a huge chunk of the United States becomes part of the United States as a result of the Mexican War, and the small United States Army that fought it took proportionally pretty high casualties. So there was serious fighting in that war, and it was an extraordinarily successful war militarily from the United States perspective, although Grant and others had qualms about its justice.
Well, what have you found out about, are historians split on Granger, or is he thought of mostly as sort of a difficult or heroic, or sort of
Well, that's an interesting question. One thing, when you're writing the first biography of someone, it's kind of fun because you get to puncture some myths and correct some facts. Like, I mean, something as simple as the date of Granger's birth is widely mistaken.
Okay.
So I get the correct date. But there are myths, for example, at Chattanooga, which is the other major battle that Granger is involved with, and the one where he clashes with Grant, because that's the only time in the war that and the subsequent East Tennessee campaign are the only times when he's directly under Grant's command. And there's a famous scene just before the assault on Missionary Ridge, which is one of the most famous assaults in American military history, when there's a delay in the order of the troops to attack, according to conventional history. And conventional history, including quite good historians like Peter Cousins, put forward what I regard as a myth, and I think I prove it's a myth, which is that Granger got the order to attack. He commands the two divisions in the center of Thomas's line that are going to play the key role in the assault, one commanded by Sheridan, the other commanded by Thomas Wood. But according to conventional history, Granger delays giving this order because he's distracted by some artillery unit that he's overseeing the shelling from. You know, and just on its face, that didn't seem to me to make much sense. It didn't seem to me a logical reason for the delay. I mean, why on earth would, I mean, all these generals are right there with Granger at Orchard Knob. It doesn't make any sense that he's not going to carry out orders to attack it. And I establish, I think, pretty clearly that the reason for the delay is something else. Grant has just taken over the Army of the Cumberland, and he's deferring to George Thomas, who's the commander of that army, who he's, in essence, superseding. And he's making this suggestion that Thomas attack and capture the rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge. And Thomas is reluctant to do that. And so Thomas is not interpreting what Grant says as an order. But when finally Grant explicitly orders Thomas to attack, Thomas tells Granger, and Granger attacks. So it's a myth, the standard history. But it's just a sidebar here. That assault on Missionary Ridge, which is so famous, and rightly so, in American military history, in reality, none of the generals order it. They order it to capture the rifle pits at the base, but when the troops get there, they discover a flaw in the orders because they're still under fire from the top of the ridge from the Confederates. And so the junior officers and the rank and file on their own decide to go up Missionary Ridge. And Grant and the other generals are at first surprised and taken aback by this. So really, that's a battle that is not won by any of these great generals, but by the ordinary...
Was Granger with those guys going up?
He was not going up. So Sheridan and Wood went up with the troops, but Granger was intimately involved in the back, and he was one of the first to send orders when he realized what was going on to say, okay, keep going. But at first there's some confusion there. And,
well, since you're doing the first book on Granger, was there enough? Well, obviously you got enough for the book. Was there? You had to pull from all kinds of sources. I was reading the introduction. It looks like you did everything from sort of the old school way of going to libraries and books, but you did a lot on the internet, and you even mentioned roadside historical markers. So it looks like you covered the range of. Sure.
Yeah. There's. The roadside historical markers I mentioned, that was a trip my wife and I took. A couple of years ago, we took a trip, saw family and friends going south in the wintertime, and I wanted to combine it with some Civil War research. So We stopped off, our first stop was in Virginia, where Gordon Granger's descendant, Gordon Granger IV, I'd previously arranged to meet there, and he had some letters of Granger's to his wife near the end of Granger's life when he was stationed in New Mexico. So those were very useful. I photographed them there, and he allowed me to use them in the book. Then we stopped off at Chickamauga, which was great. But there's an amusing anecdote. We went to Chattanooga the next day, but I had to go back to Chattanooga a couple of months later. And the reason is I was with my wife, and I didn't want to impose too much on the battlefield tour with her. So I did not go at that time, although I did on the next visit, to the National Park Service Museum, which is at the top of Lookout Mountain. The reason is Granger wasn't at the top of Lookout Mountain, and so I said, I know all that stuff. And I went to where I thought was Orchard Knob, but turned out not to be Orchard Knob. There's a national cemetery there, which I was under the mistaken impression was Orchard Knob. It's near Orchard Knob, but I soon discovered it wasn't, so I had to go back to Chattanooga to go to the real Orchard Knob site. But,
all right, so I can't.
And I also went on, the two trips I took down south, I went to the grave site, and I went to another trip to western New York to where Granger was from.
You did a lot on the internet, but you didn't do everything on the internet.
I did.
You still got out there to the.
Yeah, the internet. The virtues of the internet are that so many original sources are now on it. The primary.
The full text too, and
the primary source for the book is the official records of the United States Army during the Civil War. They were published in paper in about, I'm guessing, but I think about 70 volumes.
Yeah, I think I remember in the pre-internet days in libraries I've worked in, I remember seeing, yes, it was a humongous, but they're all online.
They're all online, which is a beautiful thing. Now, the internet may have destroyed newspapers, maybe damaging publishers, but there's some great things on it.
Well, before I really want to get to the, it's in the subtitle, the importance in Juneteenth. Could you tell us a little bit, tell us what Juneteenth is and why General Granger is important to Juneteenth?
Sure. Juneteenth refers to an order issued by Granger on June 19th, 1865. And Juneteenth is basically an African-American dialect term for that date. And the reason it became significant to African Americans in Texas and beyond.
It's actually an official holiday in Texas.
And many other places, actually.
Okay.
Now, it's spreading. It's oddly or not oddly, it's spreading in the 21st century, that celebration. The reason it's significant is that Texas had not been conquered by the U.S. Army during the Civil War. There was some military conflicts in Texas, but basically the Confederates were successful at repelling Union attacks during the war. Granger, at the end of the war, is stationed in Mobile, Alabama. He'd spent a long time from early August 1864 until April 1865 on the campaign to capture at first the forts in Mobile Bay and then the city of Mobile. And at the end of the war, now serving under Sheridan, whom earlier in the war he himself had commanded, Granger is sent to Texas as commander of all U.S. troops in Texas. And one of his orders there is to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. That, as you recall, had been issued by Lincoln, the now deceased.
It was like 2 years before, right?
Yeah, right. It took effect on January the 1st, 1863. And it freed slaves under Confederate control, but ironically, because they were under Confederate control, they couldn't be freed. So they were only freed as the war went on. Now, also, early in 1865, when Lincoln was still alive, Congress had passed and he had signed the 13th Amendment to free slaves, but that had not yet been ratified in June, so it was not yet in legal effect. So the only way to free slaves in Texas was under the authority of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Granger issued this order doing so. The wording of the order is significant, that Sheridan had told Granger to do
I was going to say, in that chapter I was reading, which you were about to get to, but the wording is extremely important, and you write in here that it still reverberates down to today. So okay, I didn't mean to.
No, it's fine. It's the Emancipation Proclamation in most places was kind of gradually enforced. It didn't apply to a lot of the South, including the border states, including Tennessee, states where there was significant Union presence at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not apply to. It only applied to states completely under Confederate control. And gradually, as those states were conquered by the Union Army, the slaves became free. So as Sherman marched through the South, the slaves became free as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. But in Texas, it happened suddenly, and it happened in a place that was still under Confederate control, which meant slavery was still very much in effect throughout Texas. In fact, many slave owners had brought their slaves to Texas for the reason that it was under Confederate control and that they could still exercise their power as slave owners. Sheridan had told Granger to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation and given him a sample order. But Sheridan's order, which said to instruct the slaves that they should remain where they were. But Granger went further than that, probably thinking about the logic of it. You can't instruct the slaves of anything because they're now free. But people in Texas, including the slave owners, did not really think that the Emancipation Proclamation was going to be enforced. It's reading the Texas newspapers, it's quite extraordinary, and when I read them, that they did not believe it possible for blacks to live and work in freedom in Texas, and they could not believe that at least there would not be some kind of forced labor system that would be slavery in all but name. So they were surprised at Granger's order, and especially at the very explicit language in it, which went beyond Sheridan's instructions, which explicitly said that the freed slaves would have all the rights of anybody else, and that any future existence between slave owners and the freed slaves would be a matter of employer and employee. And while he advised the slaves to remain where they were, he did not instruct them because he's realizing these are free people. So that was published in newspapers, and even though communications are not great, that word spreads both among whites and blacks in Texas, and it has a profound impact. It's a startling thing to almost everybody in Texas. And so in later years, African Americans in Texas celebrated on that date. And it's not just a kind of feel-good celebration. In Reconstruction as a whole, as you probably know, that there's all this progress in civil rights, but then much of it is lost when Reconstruction ends in 1877. Jim Crow laws are established in much of the South.
Well, that was another 100 years before.
Before the promise, the civil rights promise of Reconstruction is fulfilled in the Martin Luther King era in the 20th century. But in Texas, as opposed to much of the South, in part because of its indigenous Juneteenth celebrations, African Americans actually retained political power better than in much of the Deep South.
Well, it was interesting in the book. It was kind of funny in a way. When he was sent to Texas, they made it sound like, well, just go down there. Texas is huge. Just go down there, restore order, return allegiance to the U.S., tell all the slaves are free. It's like, it just sounds like an awful tall order.
Right, and we laugh about it, but in fact, it's a bit grim. So we probably, I don't mean to.
Well, I mean, but
Texas was in grim.
But telling someone, just go down and restore order, like it was the simplest,
And furthermore, there's all the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. I mean, these are interesting times in the United States, which enable obscure people like Granger to play these key roles, but also there's a lot going on. For example, in Texas, Granger does get reinforcements, but these troops are not to restore order in Texas, badly though that is needed. They're being sent to the Mexican border because if you read Sheridan's memoirs, and if you know what Grant was doing at the time, their main concern is nothing to do with what's going on in Texas, but it's what's going on in Mexico, which is a whole different story, which I won't get into too much, but there's a civil war in Mexico. There's an Austrian emperor who's been installed by the French emperor in violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The American government wants them out, but there's a dispute within the American government. Grant is much more hawkish on this than Seward, the Secretary of State. Seward thinks they're going to get him out anyway, and he doesn't want to provoke a war with Mexico. And so anyway, so Granger also has to keep an eye on the Mexican border, and that's...
Well, just makes you, realize that all the history we don't know is just so vast. It's well, finally, why don't we just end with this? What would you like people, if you could say one or two things, what do you want people to know most about General Granger here? If you could just say, sum it all up. And what you want them to know.
I would say is Granger's story is an incredibly interesting one, and I don't claim that he's unique. There's a lot of incredibly interesting stories in the Civil War, and this is one of them, and it's never been told before.
Okay.
There were a couple of sources I didn't mention were obituaries of Granger, long obituaries in organizations, one for West Point graduates and one for veterans of the Army of the Cumberland, both written by Civil War generals who knew Granger. And so these, in part, told the story back then for the people who knew him and had served with him, but bringing it out as a full-fledged biography, I think is
Are you
interesting.
Working on anything else?
I'm working on a historical novel about the last 4 months in the life of General Grant, which has a lot of Civil War.
Up at the cottage?
Partly at the cottage,
Okay.
but mostly actually in New York City just before that.
Okay,
But, yeah.
all right. Very good. So if you want to hear more or ask Bob some questions, he's going to be here on Thursday, March 27th at our noon author talk here in the library. But until then, you can come buy a book that day, or we have a couple of copies here you can come and check out. So the book is General Gordon Granger, The Savior of Chickamauga, and the man behind Juneteenth. So thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot, Joe. It was a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on Meet the Author.